On March 2nd, 2060, Shen Xiao found himself sitting inside the office of a local loan shark. The gang boss, a man named Zhang Jinxi from the Shijian group, aggressively questioned the young man about his plans for the 5 million he wanted to borrow. Although clearly terrified, Shen Xiao simply wanted the cash and readily accepted the warning that the borrowing costs would be unusually high. The criminal laid out his terms, demanding an annual return of 7.5 million on the initial loan, along with collateral of equal worth. With trembling hands, Shen Xiao surrendered his home's property deed to secure the deal. Inspecting the paperwork, Zhang pointed out the building's age and appraised it at no more than 4 million. In his mind, however, the boss celebrated how easily he was tricking the foolish kid into risking such a valuable asset. Feigning hesitation, Zhang threatened to cancel the agreement entirely, claiming the house was insufficient to cover the requested amount. This caused Shen Xiao to panic. Desperately pleading for assistance, the young man insisted that even 4 million would be enough, explaining that a fortune teller had predicted massive future profits for him. Believing he had finally trapped a hopeless gambling addict, Zhang coldly dropped his final offer to a maximum of 3.5 million. Acting completely thrilled, Shen Xiao expressed his deep gratitude and swore to settle the debt shortly. Consequently, the loan shark adjusted the contract, requiring a repayment of over 4 million within just 3 months under the threat of seizing the property. Shen Xiao agreed to these harsh conditions without a second thought, though he did add a single special requirement that left Zhang feeling quite curious. Barely 10 minutes passed before the young man walked out of the building, receiving a dismissive wave from one of the gang members. Almost immediately, a phone alert confirmed that 3.5 million yuan had landed in his bank account. A malicious smile spread across Shen Xiao's face. He knew the gangster was actually the fool in this situation. Society would collapse in exactly 1 month, making debt collection entirely impossible. Memories from his previous life revealed that a catastrophic natural disaster was about to strike the planet, which would permanently alter the entire ecosystem. Extreme solar radiation would push average global temperatures up to 50 degrees Celsius. This would trigger a horrific month-long heatwave apocalypse, a period of pure chaos where even ordinary animals would mutate into deadly threats. At the exact same time, Jiang sat in his office laughing at the supposedly naive customer who had accepted such terrible financial terms. One of his men nervously pointed out how strange it was for someone to trade a home worth over 4 million for a much smaller loan so willingly. Dismissing his subordinate's worries, the boss confidently stated that desperate gamblers would easily sell their own relatives for quick money, making the loss of a mere house perfectly normal behavior. Shifting to a busy city street, Shen Xiao strolled along while glued to his smartphone. Amused by his own scheme, the young man sarcastically marveled at the generosity of local lenders, having successfully secured cash from every single loan shark in town within just 1 day. He knew perfectly well that they would never see a penny of that money again. His mind drifted back to his previous life, remembering how the planet had completely dried out. As plant life withered and animals underwent terrifying mutations, human society had totally collapsed. In that desolate future, basic survival supplies became the most valuable currency on Earth. The protagonist recalled how even the wealthiest billionaires and celebrities had been reduced to begging for a simple cup of water or a single sausage just to avoid a miserable death on the streets. Now given a second chance through rebirth, he understood he still had a precious window of time to gather resources before the apocalypse hit. Lost in these thoughts, the protagonist wandered into a nearby cafe and caught snippets of an intriguing conversation. A pair of women were chatting about a highly sought-after luxury treat known as the ice cream assassin, which cost far more than typical premium brands. Overhearing this instantly darkened Shen Xiao's mood. He remembered how, in his past life, he had sacrificed his own enjoyment to repeatedly buy that exact expensive dessert for his girlfriend, Lu Wonking, despite being broke. The painful memory fueled his determination to finally treat himself. Stepping right up to the counter, the young man boldly ordered 10 servings of every single ice cream flavor available. This massive request left the gossiping women stunned, and they immediately began whispering about whether he actually had the funds to back it up. The cashier was equally caught off guard and double-checked if her customer was genuinely serious about the massive purchase. She carefully explained that their high-end selection meant buying 10 of each category would easily exceed 20,000. Before he could confirm, another female customer loudly interrupted. Judging Shen Xiao by his ordinary clothes, she mocked him and declared she would publicly kneel before him if he could actually cover the bill. Unfazed, the protagonist challenged her commitment to that promise. This only angered the woman further, leading her to brand him an arrogant fraud desperately seeking attention. The young man calmly replied that she had missed her chance to back down and would now be forced to kneel regardless. Startled by his sheer confidence, she fell silent as Shen Xiao casually revealed a staggering bank balance of 20 million to the cashier. He then instructed the nervous employee to pack up the order. At that point, a manager named Faki rushed over to handle the situation. Shen Xiao simply asked the manager to tally up the cost of buying out the shop's entire inventory. Overjoyed by the prospect of saving their monthly sales quota, Faki eagerly began calculating the final price. Shortly after, Faki came back to report that the store's entire inventory amounted to roughly 1 million. Considering the price quite reasonable, Shen Xiao chose to purchase every last tub, ensuring he would have plenty of sweet treats long after the world ended. After transferring a 300,000 down payment to the manager, the young man arranged for the massive order to be delivered to his home later. With the transaction complete, he generously announced to the other patrons that their ice cream was entirely on him, leaving the crowd completely amazed. However, the protagonist made it clear that this free treat did not apply to the rude woman from earlier, as he was still expecting her to drop to her knees. Unable to find a way out, the stuttering woman humiliatingly fulfilled her promise on the shop floor in front of everyone. Looking down at her, Shen Xiao questioned why she had behaved so haughtily when this was the inevitable result. Having settled the dispute, the protagonist exited the cafe and happily dug into his expensive dessert, highly impressed by its incredible taste. While enjoying the snack, a sudden glow from his bag reminded him of another crucial asset. A dark object materialized from within. His personal dimensional space, a unique storage ability that perfectly preserved whatever was kept inside indefinitely. Grinning at the endless possibilities, he relished the thought of easily acquiring anything he desired. What shocked the young man the most was the fact that this power had traveled back in time with him, especially since supernatural abilities were only supposed to unlock after the global catastrophe occurred. Even without understanding the mechanics behind it, Shen Xiao recognized that this spatial storage would be his ultimate advantage. Planning for the future, he figured his immediate priorities were constructing a safe bunker and gathering a massive supply of weapons and power sources. Suddenly, a ringing phone broke his concentration. Checking the screen, Shen Xiao cursed his awful luck upon seeing the caller ID. It was his ex-girlfriend, Lu Wangqing. Seeing her name immediately dragged up painful memories of their shared history. Following the tragic death of his parents in his past life, she had swooped in acting like a savior. Being young and foolish at the time, he genuinely believed she was his guiding light. The harsh truth, however, was that she only cared about his family's money, eventually demanding a staggering 880,000 cash and a new apartment just to accept his marriage proposal. She had acted like an endless black hole, draining all his finances to fund her luxurious lifestyle. She had even pushed him to sell off his family's historic estate to purchase a massive place in the city center. Worst of all, the protagonist remembered how she had ultimately traded him away to another man, as if he were nothing more than a rare commodity. During the apocalyptic future of his previous life, Shen Xiao had risked everything to protect Liu Wangqing, only for her to trade him to a more powerful survivor, as if he were mere livestock. Discarded as useless by his new captors, he was ultimately abandoned to a gruesome death that left nothing but mangled remains behind. Snapped back to the present reality, a dark expression crossed the young man's face. Since his treacherous ex-girlfriend had initiated contact, he figured it was the perfect opportunity for revenge. At that very moment, Liu Wangqing was staying in an expensive hotel room. Answering her call, the protagonist flatly asked what she wanted. Through the phone, she fabricated a sad story about losing a beloved gold necklace, pretending to be absolutely devastated by the loss. Hiding a wicked grin, Shen Xiao countered by promising to purchase 10 replacement pieces for her to cycle through. When she expressed shock at this sudden generosity, he lied about striking it rich in the cryptocurrency market and wanting to spoil her with his earnings. After she feigned worry about potential investment scams, he confidently assured her that his next financial move would be entirely foolproof. He then explained that he needed a bank loan to expand his portfolio and asked her to act as his guarantor, promising her a 5% cut of the total sum as a reward. Meanwhile, an older man's voice echoed in the hotel room, complaining about how much time she was spending in the shower. Sweetly calling out to him, Liu Wangqing promised she would be ready shortly. In her mind, she quickly weighed her financial options. Entertaining her current companion would earn her a mere 5,000, whereas simply signing a document for her ex-boyfriend would net her 50,000. Following this brief calculation, they ended the call. Knowing she had taken the bait, Shen Xiao smiled confidently, more than ready for her arrival. Focusing on his immediate survival plans, the scene shifted as the young man prepared to upgrade his home. Meeting with a construction contractor outside his property, he ordered the complete transformation of the building into an impenetrable iron and copper stronghold within exactly 30 days. Shen Xiao listed off an extreme set of requirements, demanding blast-proof doors, bullet-resistant windows, hidden steel grills, and heavily fortified walls. Furthermore, he requested an independent ecological system featuring solar energy and a 3-day emergency oxygen supply. Essentially, he wanted a disaster-proof bunker equipped with comprehensive life support. Hearing these wild demands, the stunned builder openly questioned if his client was obsessed with science fiction movies or preparing for the end of the world. Reminding the man of his advertised expertise in defensive architecture, the protagonist pushed for an agreement. Although the contractor verbally hesitated over the massive budget required, he secretly rejoiced at the thought of milking a paranoid, wealthy client for all he was worth. To eliminate any doubts, Shen Xiao displayed his massive bank account and immediately transferred a 1 million advance, essentially giving the builder a blank check for the remaining balance. Thrilled by the upfront cash, the contractor believed this gullible young man was his golden ticket to financial freedom. As they shook hands to finalize the contract, the protagonist sternly emphasized the need for top-tier materials, which the builder eagerly swore to provide. Ironically, both men were convinced they were successfully scamming the other. While the greedy contractor schemed to heavily inflate the final invoice, Shen Xiao secretly laughed, knowing perfectly well that the impending apocalypse would erase all debts before the bill came due. With the shelter project officially underway, the young man noted that his next priority was gathering easily accessible necessities, such as food and medical supplies. Understanding that human cruelty would pose a far greater threat than the natural disasters themselves, Shen Xiao realized he desperately needed weapons for self-defense. While strolling down the street, the young man scrolled through his smartphone looking for a reliable supplier. Eventually, he stumbled upon a dark web contact guaranteeing secure and completely discreet transactions for various restricted goods. After messaging the seller to ask about the purchasing process, he received instructions to arrive at a designated address exactly at 8 o'clock that evening. Arriving at the meeting spot after dark, the protagonist was rather surprised to find a crowded area instead of an isolated alleyway. Out of nowhere, a loud disturbance broke out nearby. A terrified woman was sprinting away from a gang of aggressive men, her face pale with absolute panic as she desperately tried to lose them. During her frantic dash, she crashed right into Shen Xiao. This brief pause allowed her pursuers to catch up and surround her, angrily accusing her of being a cheat. Trapped, the frightened girl grabbed onto the young man's clothes and pleaded for his protection. Staring at her face, he was entirely shocked to realize she was Li Yuyu, leaving him completely confused as to why she was in such a place. Ignoring his presence, the thugs roughly grabbed the young woman and began making fierce threats. As the terrified girl trembled in fear of what might happen next, Shen Xiao's mind briefly wandered to their shared past. Back in their high school days, Li Yuyu had been widely considered the ultimate campus goddess, holding the affection and admiration of nearly every boy at school. Snapping back to reality, he watched as one of the attackers viciously yanked her hair, demanding immediate payment if she ever wanted to walk away. Adding to the harassment, a second gang member suggested she could settle her debt using her body if she lacked the cash. Hearing enough, the protagonist stepped forward and firmly commanded the group to release her at once. Angered and caught off guard by the sudden interference, the thugs turned their attention to him. Promising to teach him a painful lesson for trying to act like a hero, one of the men charged aggressively. Despite the incoming danger, Shen Xiao maintained absolute composure. He effortlessly deflected the incoming strike with a quick motion before clamping down on his attacker's wrist with overwhelming strength. A loud scream escaped the thug's lips as the immense pressure fractured his bones right before the protagonist delivered a heavy punch and tossed the man to the ground. Suddenly, a mysterious digital interface popped up in Shen Xiao's vision. The system announced that it had detected feelings of pain, anger, and terror nearby, officially activating a strange, negative emotion collection feature. Meanwhile, the gang member still restraining Li Yuyu warned the young man not to take another step, threatening to end the girl's life if he disobeyed. Before the criminal could follow through, however, a flying brick came out of nowhere and smashed directly into his face, leaving the rest of the gang entirely speechless. Out of nowhere, another young man stepped onto the scene. openly mocking the thugs for shamelessly picking on a helpless woman. Furious at the sudden insult, one of the gang members rushed the newcomer with a baseball bat, loudly threatening to make him pay. However, Shen Xiao casually intercepted the attack. Working in total harmony, the two young men made quick work of the delinquents without breaking a sweat. The protagonist easily knocked one attacker to the ground before knocking another out cold with a single punch, while the stranger handled his own opponent just as smoothly. To ensure the message was clear, one of the downed criminals received a heavy stomp to the chest. Standing proudly over their beaten enemies, the duo asserted their absolute dominance. Shooting them a freezing, intimidating glare, Shen Xiao ordered the trash to run away. As the panicked thugs scattered into the night, a digital interface popped up to announce that his collected negative emotion points had crossed the threshold of 10, successfully unlocking a brand new administrative authority. A faint grin appeared on the protagonist's face. He found the concept of harvesting bad vibes from his enemies to be highly entertaining. Still sitting on the pavement, Li Yuya expressed her gratitude, mentioning how surprised she was to run into him in such a place. Reaching out to pull her to her feet, the young man checked if she had sustained any injuries. He then handed over his own jacket so she could cover up. The young woman thanked him once more before stating she needed to leave, and Shen Xiao simply advised her to stay safe on her way home. Once the area was clear, the helpful stranger walked over and introduced himself as Mu Kang, highly praising the protagonist's impressive fighting skills. In a massive twist of fate, Shen Xiao disclosed that they were actually scheduled to meet each other, stunning the dealer with the crazy coincidence. Attempting to follow underground protocol, Mu Kang recited a secret passcode to verify his client's identity. Unfortunately, the young man completely missed the reference. Having absolutely zero tolerance for childish spy games, the protagonist bluntly insulted his intelligence, leaving the poor guy utterly bewildered. Right on cue, the system successfully registered the seller's deep feelings of shock and embarrassment. Hoping to ease the awkward tension, Shen Xiao invented a playful counterphrase that successfully made Mu Kang burst into laughter. Moving their transaction to a much quieter location, the pair finally got down to business. The dealer pulled out a sturdy Russian handgun and a handful of ammunition, advising his customer to use the reliable firearm carefully. Because he respected Shen Xiao's combat abilities, Mu Kang proposed a special discounted rate, which was immediately accepted. Handing over the merchandise, the seller watched carefully as the young man handled it, quickly realizing he was dealing with a trained marksman. Trying to push his luck, the protagonist casually requested a silencer, extra ammo, and even a warranty document to be thrown in for free. These absurd demands left Mu Kang completely speechless, forcing him to question if his client actually grasped the concept of a friendly discount. Secretly frustrated, the dealer knew ordinary black market buyers would gladly pay twice as much for the gun alone, yet this crazy customer was asking for freebies and treating an illegal weapon like a standard kitchen appliance. He briefly considered that simply mugging the guy would be far less stressful. Noticing the heavy annoyance building up in the seller's eyes, Shen Xiao quickly promised to wire the payment right away to smooth things over. Waiting impatiently inside a high-end building, Li Wanqing was finally greeted by Shen Xiao, who immediately wrapped an arm around her waist. Annoyed by his delay, she demanded to know what took him so long and double-checked if this financial arrangement was genuinely safe. The young man smoothly brushed off her concerns, insisting that the paperwork was merely a standard procedure, and promising he would never trick her. Deep down, she scoffed at the idea of him plotting against her, entirely convinced that her ex-boyfriend was still the same obedient pushover he had always been. The couple then met with Zhang Jingxi to finalize the paperwork. As Li Wanqing signed her name on the loan documents, the gang boss openly praised both her attractive appearance and her elegant handwriting. In his mind, however, the loan shark mocked her stupidity, knowing full well that she was legally tying herself to a massive debt. A wicked grin crossed Jiang's face as he pictured exactly how he would exploit the poor girl once she inevitably failed to pay him back. Unaware of his sinister thoughts, Li Wanqing flashed her own scheming smile, secretly plotting her own selfish agenda. Later on, relaxing comfortably on his couch, Shen Xiao quietly celebrated the flawless execution of his plan. He mentally thanked his greedy ex-girlfriend for foolishly sealing her own tragic fate. Stepping outside his newly renovated property, the young man met with his construction manager one last time. The contractor proudly guaranteed that the building now met the highest military defense standards and was practically indestructible. After the protagonist expressed his deep satisfaction with the final result, the builder promised to be available for any future requests and departed. Safely locked inside his fortified bunker, Shen Xiao turned on the television to catch an alarming emergency broadcast regarding abnormal solar activity. The news anchor warned the public to brace themselves, predicting an uninterrupted wave of record-breaking heat that would soon sweep across the globe. Gripping his newly acquired firearm, the young man felt a surge of determination. The apocalyptic nightmare he had been anticipating was finally starting, but this time he was entirely ready to face it. Staring through his reinforced window, he watched the scorching sun punish the city below. According to the ongoing broadcast, violent atmospheric shifts were already pushing local temperatures past 40 degrees Celsius. Shen Xiao was well aware that this unbearable, blinding heat was merely the opening act of the disaster. Out on the streets, ordinary citizens were already sweating heavily and loudly complaining about the miserable weather, questioning when the intense heat wave would break. Seizing the perfect business opportunity, a local grocery store owner began shouting about incoming supply shortages, urging the sweating crowds to hoard food and water immediately. Internally, the greedy merchant was absolutely thrilled by the sudden climate shift, viewing it as a massive chance to get rich quick. Meanwhile, a pair of female customers tried to negotiate a better price for some incredibly expensive watermelons. Distracted by their good looks, the shopkeeper attempted to charm them into spending more by offering a 20% discount alongside some complimentary tissues. He even suggested they come over to enjoy his air conditioning later that evening, a highly inappropriate remark that left one of the women feeling deeply uncomfortable. Pressing his sales pitch, the man warned them to buy the fruit right then and there, claiming the extreme weather might completely ruin whatever inventory he had left for the next day. Another shopper tried to negotiate a cheaper price for bottled water, but the merchant immediately rejected the offer, using the excuse that he was just running a small local business. Observing this interaction from afar, Shen Xiao instantly recognized the store owner as Li Dafu. Seeing the man's face triggered a painful memory from his previous life. Back then, the cruel shopkeeper had publicly branded him a thief. Even though the young man had simply dropped an item and was just picking it up to return it to the shelf, Li Dafu refused to listen. Judging the boy solely by his worn-out clothing, the merchant loudly accused him of stealing. Without bothering to hear Shen Xiao's side of the story, the rest of the customers quickly joined in on the harsh judgment, rendering his desperate attempts to defend himself completely useless. Returning his focus to the present reality, the protagonist stepped into the packed grocery store, scanning the chaotic scene with a grave expression. He quickly spotted a standard bag of potato chips marked with the outrageous price tag of 50. Unable to resist mocking the situation, Shen Xiao asked the owner if the snacks were secretly coated in gold or magically cured heat stroke to warrant such an insane cost. Although visibly irritated by the sarcastic comment, Li Dafu attempted to keep his temper in check. Almost immediately, the young man's digital interface popped up, successfully harvesting a wave of disdain from the merchant. Losing his patience, the store owner rudely ordered the protagonist to leave the premises and warned him not to handle merchandise he clearly couldn't afford. Once again, the system flashed, capturing the man's rising annoyance. Wearing a mocking smirk, Shen Xiao casually wondered aloud how the merchant managed to sleep soundly surrounded by so much valuable inventory, heavily implying that he should be very worried about getting robbed. This subtle threat temporarily stunned Li Dafu. Recovering his voice, the angry shopkeeper accused the young man of losing his mind to the extreme heat and threatened physical violence. Suddenly shifting his approach, the protagonist accurately guessed that the older man suffered from night sweats and insomnia. This unexpected observation caught Li Dafu completely off guard, making him quietly question if his storage room had bad feng shui. Realizing he had the upper hand, Shen Xiao stepped closer and pretended to perform a mystical health assessment. Pointing out the merchant's unfocused gaze, the young man confidently diagnosed him with a severe internal deficiency. Furious at the fake medical advice, the shopkeeper angrily cursed the protagonist and his entire family. Completely unbothered by the insults, Shen Xiao calmly warned him that excessive rage was terrible for his physical well-being. To deliver his final blow, the young man flipped a few coins into the air, casually stating that the owner was heading for an early grave if he didn't start taking better care of himself. As the metal hit the floor, the system registered a massive surge of pure fury radiating from Li Dafu. Under the cover of darkness, Shen Xiao quietly observed the grocery store. Remembering how he used to helplessly endure humiliation in his previous life, he firmly resolved to extract his revenge with heavy interest this time around. Realizing he could upgrade his spatial abilities, the young man decided that the shopkeeper's recently harvested bad vibes were the perfect fuel for the task. By spending exactly 20 negative emotion points, the system successfully increased his dimensional storage capacity by an impressive 200 cubic meters. With his expanded inventory fully activated, he prepared to execute his midnight heist. When morning arrived to the sound of singing birds, a clueless Li Defu strolled peacefully toward his business. However, an uneasy feeling washed over him as he neared the entrance, prompting him to rush inside. What he discovered was an absolute nightmare. Every single shelf had been stripped bare. The massive inventory he had greedily hoarded to exploit the heat wave was completely gone. Overcome with pure horror and panic, the devastated merchant screamed at the top of his lungs, desperately demanding to know the identity of the thief who had cleared out his merchandise. Safely tucked away inside his fortified bunker, Shen Xiao happily monitored the ongoing meltdown through a surveillance camera. After noting a sudden spike of 66 negative emotion points, he casually sipped a cold soda, thoroughly enjoying the fruits of his labor. Down at the grocery store, the furious owner practically threw a tantrum on the floor, still shouting for the culprit to reveal themselves. Meanwhile, a crowd of confused customers gathered outside the empty shop. Adding fuel to the fire, a pair of women started gossiping about a mysterious dark shadow spotted near the building the previous night. This spooky rumor about a potential haunting only deepened Li Defu's terror, allowing the young man's system to absorb even more waves of fear, suspicion, and rage. Deciding to witness the drama in person, Shen Xiao slipped into the growing crowd of onlookers. Pleased by the merchant's consistent emotional breakdown, the protagonist opened a bag of chips and snacked casually while enjoying the spectacle. Ready to stir the pot, he loudly complimented the delicious taste of his snack. Hearing this, Li Defu immediately spotted the familiar packaging and fiercely claimed the food belonged to his missing inventory. In response, the young man simply held up the bag and mockingly repeated his previous joke about the chips being made of solid gold, conveniently reminding the owner about his prior warnings regarding potential burglaries. Blinded by rage and insulted by the boy's sheer arrogance, the shopkeeper grabbed Shen Xiao tightly by the collar and accused him of the robbery. Completely unbothered by the physical assault, the protagonist calmly pointed out the total lack of evidence and warned the angry man about the legal consequences of making false claims. To deliver a final insult, Shen Xiao generously offered to share his leftover chips, considering the merchant clearly had nothing left to sell. Naturally, this heavy sarcasm only made Li Defu infinitely more furious as he continued to blame the young man for his vanished livelihood. Capturing another 18 points of anger from the frustrated merchant, the system flashed once more. In his own defense, Shen Xiao pointed out to the gathered crowd that potato chips were sold in countless other shops, asking the onlookers to judge the situation fairly. As the customers began to murmur and question the shopkeeper's logic, the young man flashed a defiant grin and offered a high-stakes wager. He invited Li Defu to thoroughly search his home. If a single stolen item was discovered, he promised to pay back 10 times its worth, but if the merchant found nothing, he would have to surrender his backup power generator. Eager to prove the boy's guilt, Li Defu readily agreed to the terms, leading the entire crowd of witnesses toward the young man's residence. Stepping inside the property, the group was instantly blown away by the sheer extravagance on display, quietly wondering how the young man had amassed such incredible wealth. The lavish decorations and the sparkling crystal chandelier left the merchant completely speechless. Ransacking the wardrobe only revealed a collection of high-end suits, while a quick check of the refrigerator exposed a massive stockpile of premium food and beverages. Even after discovering a hidden safe packed with solid gold bars, Li Defu desperately continued tearing through every corner of the house, failing to locate a single piece of his missing inventory. Eventually, Shen Xiao calmly asked his accuser if the inspection was finally complete. Overcome with deep embarrassment, a feeling instantly recorded by the digital interface, the shopkeeper mumbled that he had seen enough and attempted to sneak away. However, the protagonist quickly blocked his path, firmly demanding the promised payment. Turning to his audience, Shen Xiao questioned whether the older man was really going to break his word after making such baseless accusations. When Li Defu tried to worm his way out of the bet, the disappointed crowd immediately began scolding him for his shameless dishonesty. Losing his temper, the merchant suddenly lunged at the young man, only to have his hand easily caught and crushed in a punishing grip. A loud scream echoed through the room as the system happily collected 73 points of pain. Unable to handle the agony, the defeated owner surrendered and agreed to deliver the machine right away. Shen Xiao rushed him to finish the job quickly, warning that the rapidly climbing temperatures would soon make going outside completely impossible. This final defeat allowed the system to harvest a fresh wave of fear, pain, and total humiliation. Later, while relaxing in the safety of his fortified home, the protagonist received an urgent phone call from his ex-girlfriend. Sounding absolutely terrified, Li Wenqing frantically explained that a group of threatening men from the Da Hai gang had been tailing her for the past 2 days. She desperately demanded to know the truth behind her stalkers, questioning why aggressive debt collectors were suddenly hunting her down if her signature was supposedly just a simple formality. Playing the role of the wounded lover perfectly, Shen Xiao feigned deep emotional pain and sadly asked why she constantly doubted his intentions despite everything he had ever done for her. Internally amused by the situation, the young man realized the Dahai gang was moving much faster than he had originally predicted. Through the screen, he casually asked if her stalkers had figured out her home address or made any specific threats. The frightened woman explained that she had managed to lose them in a maze of alleys, sharply warning him not to play any tricks on her. Using his most comforting tone, Shen Xiao brushed off her fears, suggesting she was simply being paranoid. As he spoke, he made sure to angle his camera to perfectly display his extravagant dinner. Catching sight of the beautifully grilled salmon, Li Wenqing's face immediately transformed into a mask of pure astonishment. She demanded to know how he had managed to secure such premium ingredients during an extreme global heatwave. To further fuel her jealousy, the protagonist cracked open an icy can of soda, bragging that this meal was nothing compared to his massive hidden stockpile. Listening to these claims in absolute disbelief, his ex-girlfriend quietly pondered if he had genuinely struck it rich, especially since basic necessities were already disappearing from the city's stores. Shen Xiao took a long, refreshing sip of his cold drink and purposefully took a bite of the juicy fish, playfully boasting that his fortified home was the only comfortable place left to survive the crisis. Watching him eat, Li Wenqing was practically drooling, completely overcome by her desperate craving for a decent meal. Knowing he had successfully hooked her, the young man sympathetically asked about her own food supply. Playing the helpless victim, she complained that the lingering threat of the debt collectors made her far too terrified to remain by herself. Using her feminine charm, she seductively proposed moving into his place for a few days, promising to keep him thoroughly entertained in exchange for safe shelter. Behind his screen, Shen Xiao silently laughed at how predictably the greedy woman had fallen into his trap, mentally comparing her to a drawn-out cockroach. Feigning enthusiasm, the protagonist pointed out that she had always been overly secretive about her living arrangements in the past, before generously offering to come get her. As night finally settled in, she quickly forwarded her home address. She told him to forget their old boundaries, claiming that as her supposedly loving boyfriend, it was his absolute duty to keep her safe. Instructing her to be a good girl and wait patiently inside, Shen Xiao ended the call. On her end, the manipulative girl smugly dismissed him as a pathetic follower, fully convinced she could always control him with just a few sweet words. Meanwhile, the young man marveled at the heavy irony of the situation. The exact same woman who used to refuse him entry to her front gate had just traded her secret location for the promise of a free meal. His quiet reflection was suddenly broken by the sound of knocking at his front door. Checking the security feed, he saw an elderly neighbor accompanied by her young grandson, requesting that he open up. Unlocking the heavy entrance, Shen Xiao greeted the older woman and calmly asked what Aunt Wang needed from him. The elderly neighbor desperately pleaded to be let inside, explaining that her air conditioning unit had failed and the intense heat was becoming too much for her grandson to handle. Instead of showing sympathy, Shen Xiao immediately confronted the woman. He brought up a painful memory from his childhood, reminding her of the time she had cruelly labeled him and his mother as dirty, impoverished trash before ordering security to throw them out. Attempting to defend her past behavior, Aunt Wang brushed off the incident as ancient history and harshly criticized the young man for holding on to such a petty grudge at the expense of his own humanity. Unfazed by her guilt trip, the protagonist sarcastically agreed that while he might be completely devoid of humanity, he at least had a working air conditioner. With that final remark, he slammed the heavy door right in her face. As the angry woman shouted insults from the hallway, cursing him as a heartless brat, the system interface flashed, rewarding Shen Xiao with 20 negative emotion points. A satisfied grin spread across his face. Ready to initiate the next phase of his revenge, the young man grabbed a fresh SIM card and swapped it into his mobile device. He then settled down in front of his computer to finalize the details. Placing his phone on speaker, Shen Xiao contacted an underground associate to confirm that Liu Wangqing's exact address had been successfully delivered. He assured the person on the other end of the line that tracking her down would be incredibly simple, since she lived entirely by herself. Stepping out onto his fortified balcony to overlook the sweltering city, the protagonist quietly announced to himself that the real entertainment was finally about to begin. Meanwhile, across town, Liu Wangqing was busy admiring her reflection in the mirror. She was happily daydreaming about the lavish lifestyle waiting for her inside Shen Xiao's climate-controlled bunker. The suffocating heat inside her own apartment only fueled her impatience to escape and start over. In her arrogant fantasies, she pictured the young man catering to her every whim like a devoted servant, fully convinced that she was entitled to be treated like absolute royalty. Trusting completely in her ability to manipulate her ex-boyfriend, the young woman sat down to wait for his arrival. Lighting a cigarette to pass the time, she wore a highly self-satisfied smirk, never doubting for a second that her scheme was flawless. Suddenly, a series of aggressive knocks echoed through the apartment, startling the young woman out of her thoughts. Believing her foolish ex had arrived much earlier than expected, she rushed to open the front door with sheer excitement. However, her joyful expression instantly dissolved into pure horror. Standing in the hallway wasn't Shen Xiao, but rather the menacing leader of the Da Hai gang, flanked by several of his thugs. Panicking, she frantically demanded to know how they had managed to track down her location. The gang boss simply flashed a cruel grin, announcing that the time had finally come to settle her massive debt. Collapsing to the floor in absolute terror, Liu Wangqing desperately tried to shift the blame. She pleaded that the borrowed money actually belonged to her ex-boyfriend and insisted that he had deceitfully manipulated her into signing the guarantor documents. Completely uninterested in her desperate excuses, the criminal shoved the legal contract directly into her face, angrily pointing out that her signature made her entirely responsible for the cash. Having zero interest in listening to her excuses, the gang boss immediately commanded his thugs to tear the apartment apart and confiscate anything of value. While the criminals violently trashed her home, Liu Wangqing desperately pleaded with them to stop. She promised that Shen Xiao was already on his way and would gladly negotiate with them upon his arrival. Once the thorough looting was complete, the leader made himself comfortable on the sofa, surrounded by her stolen designer bags and expensive jewelry. Watching her most precious possessions being casually seized sent the young woman into a state of sheer panic. However, the boss merely laughed at her distress, bluntly pointing out that her pathetic collection of goods barely covered the interest on her massive loan. Flashing a dark, threatening grin, the criminal noted that his crew couldn't possibly leave empty-handed after suffering through the unbearable heat wave outside. When the menacing thugs began stepping toward her, the terrified woman scrambled backward. She frantically begged them to keep their distance, repeatedly insisting that Shen Xiao was the one holding all the cash. Desperate to redirect their aggression, she suddenly blurted out that her ex-boyfriend also possessed a massive stockpile of essential survival resources. Catching the leader's sudden pique and curiosity, Liu Wangqing eagerly elaborated, explaining that the young man was currently driving over to collect her, which would make him an incredibly easy target for their extortion. Hoping to back up her claims, she quickly dialed the protagonist's number, but the connection immediately failed. Staring at her screen in total confusion, she read an automated system message stating that the line was temporarily out of service. As she frantically redialed without any success, a cold sweat broke out across her forehead. Utterly panicked by the endless ringing, she nervously tried to convince the irritated gang boss that her boyfriend was simply too busy to hear his device. Finally losing his temper, the criminal harshly insulted her intelligence. He coldly explained that Shen Xiao had completely set her up from the start and never had any real intention of settling the financial balance. The devastating realization that she had been so brutally betrayed left the young woman entirely paralyzed with shock. Before she could even process the truth, the gang leader violently grabbed her. Despite her agonizing screams and tearful begging to be released, he twisted his hand into her hair and began pulling her across the floor. Even as she was being dragged, she continued pleading for them to hunt down Shen Xiao instead, desperately insisting he was the one with the real treasure. Completely ignoring her cries, the boss pulled her directly into the bedroom and slammed the door shut, forcing the miserable woman to physically pay off her debt to the gang. Miles away, safely monitoring the horrifying scene from his bunker, the protagonist smiled with deep satisfaction. Thoroughly enjoying the flawless execution of his revenge, he silently wished his treacherous ex-girlfriend a wonderful time experiencing the new apocalyptic world. The narrative shifts to the solitary illuminated window of Liu Wangqing's apartment building. Inside, having just finished getting dressed after a grueling night, the gang leader towered over the broken young woman. Curled up on the mattress and weeping bitterly after the brutal assault, she was suddenly forced to look up as the criminal roughly grabbed her chin. He fiercely demanded that she repeat every single detail she had previously mentioned regarding her ex-boyfriend's hidden wealth. Driven by sheer desperation, she eagerly confirmed that Shen Xiao possessed a fully stocked pantry, icy beverages, and functional air conditioning, insisting that his bunker lacked absolutely nothing. Since she had been stripped of everything valuable, the weeping girl pleaded with her tormentor to finally release her and hunt down the protagonist instead. Tossing her back onto the bed, the boss quickly calculated the immense value of such a luxurious hoard during a deadly heat wave. Recognizing that they had stumbled upon a massive prize, he resolved to raid the young man's stash immediately. Left behind in her misery, Liu Wangqing seethed with deep resentment, silently hoping her ex-boyfriend would suffer a horrific death for setting her up. A short while later, the criminal crew marched through the dark streets toward their next destination. They were actively guided by Aunt Wang, who pointed out Xin Xiao's fortified home while eagerly listing off his known assets. The bitter elderly neighbor loudly complained about the young man's extreme selfishness, noting that he refused to share even a single drop of water. Hearing her grievances, one of the leading thugs guaranteed she would receive a cut of the loot once they successfully secured the provisions. Pretending to be deeply grateful, Aunt Wang showered the criminal with fake compliments about his impressive leadership and generosity. Internally, the old woman maliciously daydreamed about watching the arrogant protagonist cry for mercy and unconditionally surrender his comfortable home to her. Viewed from above, the hostile mob finally arrived at the heavily defended property, fully prepared to break inside. Glancing up at the imposing structure, one gang member nervously noted that their target had clearly prepared for trouble. Gathering around the main entrance, the armed thugs readied themselves for the assault, with their boss tightly gripping a sharp machete. Eager to impress his leader, one overconfident subordinate bragged that a single powerful kick would be enough to smash the door open. He confidently stepped forward, but the moment his foot crossed a barely visible line on the pavement, a massive electrical current surged through his entire body. The stunned crowd could only watch in absolute horror as the agonizing shock caused the man to scream uncontrollably. As the first thug collapsed and began twitching on the pavement, his clueless companions simply mocked his clumsiness, assuming he had suffered a sudden muscle cramp. Stepping forward to assist his fallen friend, another gang member was instantly hit by the same invisible current the moment their skin touched. Violent spasms overtook his body as he cried out in agony. Witnessing this horrifying scene, Aunt Wang and the remaining criminals stood frozen in utter disbelief. Suddenly, a hidden loudspeaker roared to life, allowing Shen Xiao's digital interface to harvest the crowd's rising confusion. Adding a layer of dark comedy to the situation, the sound system began blasting a cheerful pop tune about extreme good fortune and endless prosperity. Matching the rhythm of the bizarre soundtrack, the electrical voltage surged even higher, physically tossing the shocked thugs across the concrete. Realizing the danger was rapidly spreading across the ground, the gang boss and the elderly neighbor desperately leaped backward to avoid the invisible trap. Meanwhile, the young man's system happily absorbed a massive influx of panic, shock, and total astonishment from the frightened mob. Safe inside his fortified bunker, the protagonist casually monitored the chaotic security footage on his computer. He found the entire spectacle highly amusing, even humming along to the upbeat music, while joking that his lucky visitors had accidentally discovered his defensive grid. Out on the street, one of the furious criminals angrily demanded that Shen Xiao stop playing childish games and settle his financial obligations immediately. Seizing the chance to criticize him, Aunt Wang shouted her own accusations. She loudly questioned his moral upbringing, furious that he had somehow found the cash to heavily renovate his property while supposedly refusing to pay off his legal loans. Completely ignoring their outrage, the young man lounged comfortably in his chair, quietly enjoying an icy popsicle as the madness unfolded outside. Through the intercom, he wore a mocking grin as he reminded the gang leader that his former apartment was easily worth 4 million, a sum that perfectly covered the 3.5 million owed. Smoothly shifting all legal blame onto Liu Wangqing, Shen Xiao advised the criminals to hunt his ex-girlfriend down instead, firmly stating that the debt was no longer his problem. Although furious, the gang boss knew perfectly well that in this new apocalyptic reality, hoarded supplies were infinitely more precious than useless cash. Sensing the leader's greed, the protagonist offered a final piece of advice. He warned the mob to walk away peacefully while he was still feeling generous, making it very clear that his politeness would vanish if they continued to push their luck. Hovering his hand over a large red switch on his desk, Shen Xiao didn't hesitate for another second before slamming it down. A devastating surge of electricity instantly flooded the street, prompting agonizing screams from the men outside who simply could not endure the intense shock. As the defeated attackers writhed on the ground, the system collected another rich harvest of sheer despair and physical pain. Forced into a humiliating retreat, the surviving thugs scrambled away into the night, dragging their badly injured companions with them. Over his shoulder, the furious boss shouted that his gang would never forgive this insult, a threat that only served to generate even more anger points for Shen Xiao's collection. Left standing alone, the elderly neighbor was absolutely terrified by the menacing presence of the young man's impenetrable fortress. By the time morning arrived, the ongoing disaster had reached a new extreme, pushing outdoor temperatures to a suffocating 52 degrees Celsius. Safely inside his air-conditioned shelter, the young man lounged on the sofa and snacked on grapes. Meanwhile, the television broadcast reported numerous heat-stroke fatalities across the region, strongly urging residents to remain indoors. Grasping the severity of the crisis, he grabbed his smartphone to catch up on the latest news. Instead, he found his neighborhood group chat flooded with angry messages. The residents harshly accused him of being a selfish monster for enjoying food and cold air while others suffered. They demanded he step outside and explain himself, threatening to brand him a murderer if he refused to share his supplies. Unfazed, Shen Xiao simply ignored their demands and kept reading. As he did, his digital interface absorbed the neighbor's intense jealousy and rage, pushing his collected negative emotion points past the 1,000 mark and triggering a reward calculation. Standing in front of his fully stocked refrigerator, he resolved to push the desperate residents a bit further. With a wicked grin, he snapped a photo of his massive food supply and forwarded it to the community chat alongside a mocking comment. Instantly, the group erupted with dozens of replies pleading for basic necessities like water and food. In response, Shen Xiao firmly stated that he was not running a charity organization, making it clear that anyone wanting supplies would have to barter with items of equal value. This condition sparked a fresh wave of fury. The neighbors insulted his selfishness and warned that he wouldn't know peace either if they were left to starve. Highly amused by the chaos and the steady stream of negative points he was gathering, the protagonist happily tossed himself back onto the sofa. Suddenly, an alert flashed across his vision, announcing that his emotional currency had reached 3,000 points. Consequently, his spatial power received an upgrade called Basic Spatial Cut, a skill capable of slicing through anything within a 3-meter radius by tearing the air itself. Intrigued by the new ability, the young man decided to use an apple resting on his table for target practice. With a casual wave of his hand, an unseen blade cleanly split the fruit in two. Thrilled by the result, he noted that his new reality was becoming increasingly entertaining. Far from the safety of the bunker, an orange jeep raced through the deserted city streets. The vehicle eventually stopped, and Liu Wangqing stepped out alongside a security guard. The gang leader, heavily prepared to assault the protagonist, was also present. As the hostile group assembled on the pavement, the boss double-checked with one of his men to ensure they had the right location. The subordinate quickly confirmed that Shen Xiao's fortified home was located in the building just ahead. Approaching Liu Wangqing, the loan shark playfully asked if she felt any remorse about raiding her ex-boyfriend's home. She immediately charmed the criminal, insisting he was now her only love. Showing zero hesitation, she harshly insulted the protagonist as worthless garbage and swore that his life would end that very night. While the Dahai gang leader observed the target building to strategize, a pair of local residents approached. They volunteered to guide the mob, claiming their deep knowledge of the area would prevent any chance of escape. The boss happily accepted the offer, guaranteeing them a share of Shen Xiao's resources in exchange for their help. Thrilled by the greedy bargain, the two men promised to reveal a secret shortcut to the bunker. Total chaos erupted along their route as the criminals began violently looting the residential complex. When one of the traitorous neighbors noticed the thugs ransacking his own shop, he desperately tried to intervene. However, a gang member quickly shut him down, declaring that everything in the area now belonged to their boss. Around them, defeated residents cried and begged for mercy, deeply regretting their foolish trust in the ruthless beasts. Finally, the massive armed group, including Liu Wangqing and the gang leader, assembled outside their primary target. Unbothered by the hostile crowd, Shen Xiao dragged a comfortable armchair outside. While casually chewing on a piece of meat, he sarcastically asked if they had come searching for him. The furious boss demanded that the young man stop playing games and surrender his stockpile immediately if he wanted to survive. Instead of panicking, the protagonist calmly wiped his mouth with a napkin. Staring coldly at the mob, he questioned whether their parents had ever taught them the basic manners of not interrupting a person's meal. This arrogant response pushed the gang leader over the edge, and he screamed for his subordinates to finish the boy once and for all. Despite being completely surrounded, Shen Xiao effortlessly dodged the incoming strikes. Quickly launching a counterattack, he slammed one attacker's head directly into the pavement, just as another thug swung a spiked mace straight toward his skull. Swiftly dodging the incoming weapon, Shen Xiao launched a devastating kick that instantly knocked out two attackers. Realizing standard tactics were failing, one of the heavier thugs charged forward, swinging a massive axe. Just as the young man prepared to secretly unleash his spatial cut ability, a mysterious object suddenly landed right in the middle of the hostile crowd. The canister exploded violently, swallowing the entire street in a thick cloud of tear gas. Choking on the smoke, the gang leader mistakenly assumed the protagonist had armed backup and immediately ordered his crew to retreat for the night. While covering his face to avoid the fumes, Shen Xiao spotted a familiar figure emerging from the shadows. It was the underground arms dealer, Mu Kang, who casually complimented the young man's fighting skills despite the chaotic situation. Stunned by the unexpected arrival, the protagonist questioned what the merchant was doing there, prompting Mu Kang to mention he had brought even better weapons for sale. Carrying a cooler, the dealer noted how comfortably Shen Xiao was living, especially since he had access to ice-cold drinks during a deadly heat wave. Tossing a fresh bottle of water to the merchant, the young man demanded to know the real reason for his visit. Mu Kang explained that he had been quietly tracking the Da Hai gang for several days because they were actively stealing his local business, though he never expected their latest target to be Shen Xiao. He also subtly hinted that the young man clearly possessed special methods to maintain such an impressive survival stockpile. This dangerous observation earned him a sharp, suspicious glare. Realizing he had crossed a line, the dealer quickly backed off and revealed his true intentions. He proposed a temporary partnership to steal a massive hoard of purified water, currently hidden away by the Da Hai boss. Recognizing that clean water was becoming an incredibly precious resource as global temperatures continued to climb, the protagonist agreed to the heist, leaving Mu Kang pleasantly surprised. However, Shen Xiao instantly ruined the merchant's excitement by demanding a ruthless 90-10 split of the profits. The dealer loudly complained that such an unfair deal was basically highway robbery, allowing the young man's system to secretly harvest 40 points of pure shock from his reaction. When Shen Xiao coldly threatened to cancel the agreement entirely if he didn't stop complaining, a desperate Mu Kang clung to his leg. He practically begged for at least 20% of the cut just so he wouldn't starve. Internally, the merchant reasoned that the young man's extreme arrogance proved he was hiding a powerful trump card, making him the absolute best partner for the job. Settling back comfortably onto his couch, the protagonist finally accepted the 80-20 split, but strictly on the condition that he would always get first choice of any future merchandise the dealer acquired. Left with no other choices, Mu Kang reluctantly agreed to the strict terms, though he couldn't help but call the young man entirely ruthless. Once the agreement was settled, Shen Xiao shifted to a serious tone, stating that their immediate priority was mapping out the enemy compound and locating the patrol units. Moving to a nearby rooftop, the arms dealer directed his partner's attention toward the gang's headquarters. He explained that the heavily armed facility functioned as a local water trading hub. Furthermore, the merchant noted that the criminals had abducted several women, forcing them to entertain the gang's higher-ups, a grim reality confirmed by the sight of a local boss cornering a woman in a red dress down below. Although Mu Kang knew the general water storage area was located at the rear of the complex, he admitted he lacked the exact coordinates of the primary stockpile. Hearing this, Shen Xiao proposed a daring strategy. He would sneak inside the facility alone, while the dealer caused a loud distraction on the perimeter. This reckless idea immediately panicked Mu Kang. Brushing off his partner's alarm, the protagonist confidently stated he had his own ways of getting things done. He then leaped gracefully toward the compound, easily slipping past an outer sentry without making a sound. Moments later, the young man was casually strolling through the enemy's internal courtyards. His smooth infiltration hit a snag when a guard intercepted him, demanding proper identification from the unfamiliar visitor. Without breaking a sweat, Shen Xiao flashed a blank white card and confidently lied, claiming Boss Liu had personally ordered him to conduct a water inventory. The suspicious guard immediately rejected the weak excuse, mocking the intruder for attempting such a terrible trick. As the system silently absorbed 5 points of mockery from the thug, the protagonist decided it was time to test his spatial cut on a living target instead of mere fruit. Unleashing his power, an unseen blade struck the guard head-on, allowing the interface to harvest a sudden spike of pure agony and terror. The commotion quickly alerted a second gang member nearby. Startled, the thug instantly opened fire on the young man. However, Shen Xiao swiftly deployed his spatial anomaly again, cleanly slicing the shooter in half and securing another 200 points of fear and despair for his system. The loud gunshots triggered a massive alarm, sending a swarm of armed men rushing toward the scene. Slipping away in the ensuing chaos, the protagonist ducked behind a nearby wall. Suddenly, a hand reached out and grabbed him. Startled, he spun around to find Liu Yu hushing him. Shocked to run into her again, he quietly asked what she was doing in such a dangerous place. The young woman sadly explained that she had been taken prisoner, whispering a quick question to see if he had suffered the same unfortunate fate. Ignoring her previous question, Shen Xiao immediately asked if she could lead him to the gang's water supply. When she confidently agreed, the young man realized this unexpected alliance was making his infiltration much easier. Suddenly, a clattering metal bucket successfully drew the guard's attention elsewhere. Taking advantage of the distraction, the young woman quickly guided him down a hidden path completely free of security cameras. As they silently navigated the compound's dark alleys and neared their target, the protagonist instructed his companion to stay hidden and wait for his return. Standing before a massive metal door, Shen Xiao focused his energy. His glowing hand made contact with the surface, instantly shattering the heavy barrier into countless pieces. The deafening blast completely terrified a guard stationed inside, who frantically demanded to know how someone had breached the warehouse. Giving the thug zero time to react, the young man dashed forward and eliminated him with a single, precise strike. This quick neutralization allowed his digital interface to harvest another 360 negative emotion points. Waiting outside, Li Yu grew increasingly anxious about how long the infiltration was taking. Her worries peaked when a massive explosion suddenly rocked the storage building. Grabbing a heavy brick from the ground for self-defense, she watched a dark figure slowly emerge from the thick smoke and flames. Assuming it was an angry gang member, she cried out and swung her makeshift weapon with all her might, only stopping inches away when she finally recognized Shen Xiao's face. The protagonist simply announced that their mission was successful, and it was time to escape. To trigger the next phase of the operation, he pulled out a flare gun and shot a bright projectile into the night sky. While the young woman observed his excited demeanor with clear curiosity, Mu Kang spotted the glowing signal through his binoculars from a nearby rooftop. Mildly impressed by his partner's efficiency, the arms dealer immediately grabbed his prepared cart full of Molotov cocktails. He began hurling the firebombs down onto the enemy compound, quickly transforming the entire base into a blazing inferno. Down below, a panicked guard desperately ordered his crew to extinguish the rapidly spreading flames. Realizing the incoming projectiles were actually firebombs, another thug frantically ordered everyone to run for their lives. Amidst the spreading panic, the captive girl quickly led Shen Xiao down a narrow alleyway toward the south exit. Maintaining a sharp focus, the young man pushed forward without letting the surrounding chaos distract him. Suddenly, his ex-girlfriend, Liu Wanking, blocked their path. Desperately attempting to use her feminine charm and their shared history, she begged him to rescue her. She even promised to completely forgive him for framing her with the massive loan debt if he helped her escape. Flashing a mocking smile, the protagonist bluntly stated that she clearly failed to grasp her current reality. Tears began streaming down her face as the grim truth set in. Weeping bitterly, she described her daily nightmare of being forced to entertain the gang members, explaining how any attempts to resist or run away only resulted in severe beatings. Having nowhere else to go, she swore she would do absolutely anything if he just took her with him. In response, Shen Xiao coldly listed off her past betrayals. He reminded her how she had constantly humiliated him for his lack of money, cheated on him with multiple men, and ultimately led a violent gang right to his doorstep. As they locked eyes in a tense standoff, she was entirely stunned by his harsh words. Internally, the young man recalled the fatal betrayal from his previous life, quietly wondering if she had ever anticipated facing the consequences of her cruel actions. Showing absolutely zero sympathy for her manipulative performance, he shoved her to the dirt and criticized her terrible acting skills. Turning to his new companion, he signaled that it was time to leave. As the pair walked away, a furious Liu Wanking screamed from the ground that he was a heartless monster, threatening that no one would find peace if she was left to die. Immediately, the system registered her intense hatred and rewarded the young man with 999 points. Meanwhile, the boss of the Dahai gang stumbled out of the burning warehouse, desperately screaming about the safety of his precious water supply. Emerging through the thick smoke with his armed subordinates, he was devastated to find his entire storage facility reduced to ashes. His devastation quickly turned into blind rage when he spotted a mocking message left by the protagonist on the surviving wall. Roaring in fury, the criminal demanded to know who had done this. Seizing the perfect opportunity, Liu Wanqing spoke up from the ground. She falsely claimed that Shen Xiao was the culprit and that she had been injured while bravely trying to stop him. Deepening her lies, the manipulative woman insisted that her ex-boyfriend had deeply insulted the boss, calling him worthless trash who didn't deserve such valuable resources. To ensure his maximum anger, she hugged the leader and fabricated a final detail, swearing that the young man had promised to slaughter the entire gang. Completely blinded by rage, the boss immediately rallied his men, ordering them to march toward the south gate and butcher the scoundrel. From a secure vantage point, Shen Xiao and his companion watched the enemy compound go up in flames. Noticing several oil barrels nearby, the young woman pointed out the massive destruction they had caused, a sentiment the protagonist easily agreed with. Down below, the furious boss of the Dahai gang was marching toward the exit with his remaining thugs. Holding a lit torch, Shen Xiao mockingly welcomed the criminal, sarcastically praising how quickly he had arrived. Enraged, the gang leader immediately commanded his men to capture and kill the young man. Instead of fighting directly, the protagonist simply tossed his torch onto the scattered oil barrels. A massive ring of fire instantly erupted, trapping the entire mob inside. As the red-faced boss violently swore he would murder Shen Xiao, the digital interface happily absorbed another 999 points of pure hatred. In his mind, the young man silently thanked the criminal for being such an excellent source of negative energy. Later, safely back inside the fortified bunker, the newly formed trio celebrated their flawless victory over a lavish hot pot dinner filled with fresh vegetables and premium meats. While sipping on chilled juice, Mu Kang highly commended his partner's outstanding execution of the heist. As the young woman plated the food, the arms dealer joked about how the Dahai boss was probably tearing his own ruined base apart in a fit of absolute rage. Deeply grateful for her rescue, the girl sincerely thanked Shen Xiao, acknowledging that she would have died in that blazing hellhole without his intervention. Offering a warm smile, the protagonist brushed off her formal gratitude, reminding her that they were old high school classmates. She continued to express her appreciation regardless, stating that his heroic actions had restored her faith in humanity. Mu Kang readily agreed, adding his own praise for the brilliant extraction. Still completely baffled by the sheer scale of their success, the dealer finally asked how one person could possibly drain an entire gang's water reservoir so quickly. A towering mountain of stolen water jugs sat right in the middle of the room, serving as undeniable proof of the impossible feat. Dodging the question, Shen Xiao vaguely stated that he had his own special methods, advising Mu Kang to focus entirely on figuring out how to quietly sell the massive inventory instead. Shifting the conversation, the protagonist asked his former classmate why she had completely vanished right after their high school graduation. Looking down with a heavy sadness, she shared the painful memory of a sudden family tragedy. She explained that she had returned home one day to an empty house, revealing that both of her parents had mysteriously disappeared at the exact same time. Before anyone could process her tragic story, a sudden bright glow outside caught their attention. Rushing to the bunker's reinforced window, the group was stunned to see that a massive, uncontrolled fire had broken out, rapidly swallowing the entire city block in terrifying flames. Seeing the inferno spreading right up to their doorstep, Mu Kang immediately started screaming in absolute panic. Watching the surveillance monitors, the group witnessed chaos as desperate neighbors fled, and a man used bottles to spread the fire. One neighbor appeared on camera, weeping and pleading for someone to save her child from the blaze. This sight infuriated Mu Kang, who punched the screen while accusing the gang leader of trying to wipe everyone out. Turning to Shen Xiao, the young woman asked if they should intervene. The protagonist, however, saw through the tactic, realizing the boss was using innocent lives and moral pressure to bait him into leaving his fortress. Outside, the gang leader roared for Shen Xiao to face him, threatening to incinerate everything to see how long his turtle shell would hold up. A subordinate cheered for the plan, suggesting they add even more fuel to ensure that even if the fire didn't reach the targets, the smoke would suffocate them. Staring at the burning building with absolute confidence, The boss taunted the young man, asking if he still believed he could win, and declaring that the battle was already over. As the entire street transformed into a massive inferno, Mukang began to panic. He warned that the rising heat would eventually penetrate the walls, roasting them alive or depleting their oxygen. Despite the growing danger, Shen Xiao stayed perfectly composed. He pointed out that he wasn't foolish enough to build a shelter without a state-of-the-art fire protection system. With a casual press of a red button, he engaged the defenses. Automatically, water cannons emerged from the structure and began firing powerful jets packed with green capsules. Upon hitting the ground, these capsules burst into a thick foam that rapidly smothered the flames. Mukang was stunned to recognize the material as military-grade nano-aerogel, questioning how a civilian could possibly acquire such high-end gear. The young woman stood beside him, equally speechless and impressed. Disbelief washed over the gang leader as he watched his strategy fail. Refusing to accept defeat, he scoffed at the scene, calling the advanced defense a final act of desperation. He ordered his men to keep fueling the fire, but the foam continued to neutralize the flames with incredible efficiency. Even as the boss screamed for them to continue, believing the fire suppressant would eventually run out, his subordinates grew worried. One goon warned him that they were nearly out of fuel, and noted that the strange white mist spreading from the foam was unlike anything he had ever seen. Grabbing a megaphone from inside his bunker, the protagonist decided to provoke his enemies further. His voice boomed across the street as he sarcastically asked the boss if he was finished playing with matches, even offering him a cold drink if he dared to step inside. This mockery sent the gang leader into a fit of rage, allowing the system to harvest another 888 points of pure anger. Realizing that fire and brute force had failed, the criminal's expression turned predatory. He decided that simply killing the young man wasn't enough. With a cruel grin, he opted to play dirty by seizing two neighbors and tying them up to use as leverage. While Shen Xiao watched the scene with a chillingly indifferent expression, the boss began his blackmail. He used the captives to guilt the young man, claiming they were only suffering because of his selfishness. One of the terrified neighbors even began to sob, shouting that the protagonist had dragged them all into this disaster by offending the gang. This display made Mukang lose his temper, and he cursed the leader, suggesting they should just go out and fight. However, the boss escalated his threats, promising to execute the hostages one by one if the bunker door remained shut. Peering through the window, the protagonist noticed that one of the victims was old Wang. A memory from a previous life flashed before him, reminding him of how the old man had once encouraged him to never give up hope as long as he was alive. His eyes filled with resolve. Turning to his teammates, he instructed Mukang to stay back and safeguard the woman while he dealt with the boss personally. Stepping out of the safety of the shelter, he walked toward the fading flames to stand face to face with his rival. He firmly stated that their conflict was strictly between the two of them, and that innocent people shouldn't be involved. The boss laughed at him for finally leaving his turtle shell, demanding the return of both his money and the water in exchange for the hostages' lives. To the villain's surprise, the young man simply smirked and dismissed the idea of being a hero, stating he had no interest in such things. Claiming that the violence had become tedious, he suggested they settle the matter with a wager, knowing the boss had built his empire on gambling. He proposed a high-stakes bet. If he lost, the boss could take everything he owned, but if he won, old Wang would be freed and the gang would retreat. The leader roared with laughter and eagerly agreed to the challenge. He slammed a dice cup onto a table, declaring that a single round of high or low would determine the winner. With unshakable confidence, the protagonist gripped his own dice cup, placed his bet on high, and prepared for the ultimate gamble. Both men assumed the stances of professional gamblers as they prepared for their legendary confrontation. With a surge of energy, the Dahai leader shook his dice cup violently, an intensity that Chen Xiao matched with equal force. Simultaneously, they slammed their cups onto the table. Unknown to the onlookers, the boss had secretly pressed a hidden button on his cup, activating a magnet to manipulate the dice. Convinced he had won, he lifted the lid to reveal 3 sixes and arrogantly claimed victory. However, the protagonist merely smiled and told him to wait, as the game wasn't over yet. Secretly utilizing his spatial cut ability, the young man had sliced through his own dice without being noticed. As he lifted his cup with an air of dominance, he jokingly suggested that the boss's dice were of poor quality. The crowd was left in shock when they saw that the number of dice under his cup had actually increased due to the cuts. Even the hostages were baffled, wondering how the leader's supposedly unbeatable hand had been surpassed. By counting the faces of the fragmented dice, the total reached 21 points, beating his opponent's perfect 18. Stunned by the result, the boss could only watch as Chen Xiao coldly announced his defeat and demanded the immediate release of the prisoners. Refusing to accept the loss, the gang leader exploded in a fit of rage, accusing his opponent of being a cheat. This wave of anger allowed the system to collect another 500 points. Ignoring the terms of their wager, the man lunged at the protagonist with a machete, screaming that he would send him to his grave. While the hostages watched in terror, the young man saw this as a chance to experiment with his powers. Just as the boss was about to strike, an object whizzed past his ear, forcing him to halt. A tear gas canister exploded on the pavement, swallowing the area in a thick cloud of smoke. Amidst the coughing and confusion, the leader ordered his men to locate and seize their target. As the air cleared, the protagonist was standing calmly before them. The boss immediately pointed him out, shouting for his subordinates to open fire. A barrage of bullets flew toward him, but the gang leader was suddenly distracted by a mysterious purple energy rift appearing in the air. This energy blade sliced through the sky and struck one of the gunmen directly, leaving the criminal boss completely speechless. Watching the chaos with a superior gaze, the young man remained entirely uninjured. Driven to desperation, the boss grabbed a rocket launcher, screaming that no level of strength could save the protagonist from such a weapon. He fired the rocket directly at Chen Xiao, roaring that once he perished, all of his wealth and resources would finally belong to the gang. In that very moment, a notification flashed from the system as a spatial barrier shimmered into existence, halting the missile's progress instantly. Behind this energy shield, the protagonist stood perfectly composed while the projectile was held firmly in place. The pressure from the barrier was so intense that the missile began to fracture, eventually crumbling into pieces. Drenched in a cold sweat, the gang leader stared in total disbelief, unable to comprehend how anyone could block a rocket with such ease. With a mocking grin, Chen Xiao questioned the man's honor, asking if he was really going to break his word just because he couldn't handle losing in public. When a second missile was launched his way, the young man didn't flinch. Instead, he used his spatial cut ability to shred the weapon into fragments. As he calmly approached the terrified leader, Chen Xiao remarked with an air of dominance that the boss lacked the strength even to negotiate. The criminal began to realize that something was deeply wrong with his opponent. Declaring that the gang leader had crossed the line far too many times, the protagonist announced that it was finally time to settle their accounts. Sensing his imminent doom and noting they were out of fuel, the boss quickly changed his strategy. He realized a direct confrontation was a death sentence and began to view the young man's strange powers as a potential gold mine. Desperately covering his face while he scrambled for a solution, he suddenly claimed the whole conflict was merely a misunderstanding. He pleaded for his life, arguing that killing him would be a waste in a world where life was so cheap. In a bid to save himself, he offered Chen Xiao half of his stash of rare antibiotics and penicillin, promising they could help him live comfortably. Although the protagonist acknowledged that medicine was hard to come by, he noted that his own secret supplies were far greater than anything the boss could imagine. Seeing his leverage slip away, the gang leader played his final card. He proposed a partnership to raid an abandoned pharmaceutical factory, claiming only he possessed the necessary access code. To the boss's immense relief, Chen Xiao agreed to the deal and declared their business for the night finished. After the leader dismissed his men and retreated into the darkness, the protagonist watched them go with a scoff. He knew that a mere password would never be enough to keep him from taking what he wanted. Moving toward the group of hostages, the protagonist reassured old Huang that the danger had passed and they were now safe, while the old man expressed his deep gratitude and offered to repay the favor in any way possible. Another neighbor in the group glared at the young man with intense malice. The system immediately picked up on this hidden terror, adding another 100 points to the protagonist's collection. Instead of accepting any rewards, the young man simply advised old Huang to return home and lock his doors securely. As night covered the city, the retreating gang began to discuss the recent encounter. One subordinate confessed to being paralyzed by the protagonist's display of power. However, the gang leader dismissed these fears. While smoking a cigar, he secretly plotted to betray the young man. He never actually intended to work together and only planned to buy time until he could seize the supplies and kill the boy. His men praised this deceptive strategy, though they remained unsettled by the fact that their target was somehow immune even to missiles. To clear his doubts, the boss ordered a subordinate to begin a secret investigation, but before he could finish the command, a spatial cut suddenly struck him. The leader fell dead onto the pavement. and his terrified followers fled into the darkness, screaming that they were being hunted by a ghost. Watching from a high rooftop, the protagonist viewed the lifeless body below with a sense of triumph, finally saying goodbye to the man who had been a constant threat. Meanwhile, a global emergency broadcast interrupted the silence, announcing that the extreme heat wave was now irreversible, and the world's ecosystem was collapsing. The authorities urged citizens to either head north to government shelters or wait for rescue. The protagonist knew better. He understood that the north would eventually become a new furnace, and that help was never coming. He realized the true horror was only starting. Soon, mutant beasts capable of surviving the heat would emerge to dismantle what was left of human society. As these monsters claimed the cities, human survivors would turn on each other, forming violent factions to fight over the last remaining resources. With this dark future in mind, he decided that his fortified home would not just be his hideout, but the final fortress of human survival. However, trouble was already brewing outside his gates. A group of starving neighbors gathered, shouting that it was unfair for one person to have plenty of food and air conditioning while they suffered. One man began pounding on the door, demanding an explanation and blaming the protagonist for their misery. Driven by desperation and jealousy, the residents decided that the shelter should be public property, planning to move in and divide the space among everyone for their collective survival. Inside the shelter, the protagonist was the picture of calm, cooking a meal to the beat of some music as if the world weren't ending outside. To further irritate his neighbors, he snapped a photo of a juicy steak resting in his perfectly chilled room, where the air conditioning was set to exactly 20.2 degrees Celsius. Once he shared the image, the group chat erupted in a frenzy of vitriol. His system immediately capitalized on the chaos, harvesting 150 points of envy, 130 of anger, and 361 of despair. Watching the numbers climb, he smirked, reflecting on how powerless rage was the most worthless currency in the apocalypse. The provocation pushed one neighbor over the edge. Consumed by a blind fury, the man slammed his phone onto the pavement and roared that if Chen Xiao wouldn't cooperate, they would take everything by force. He vowed to end the young man's life one way or another. Unfazed by the threats, the protagonist decided it was time to investigate the old factory in the West District. However, the moment he opened his door, a wall of suffocating heat slammed into him, followed immediately by a cleaver flying toward his face. As he stepped out, he narrowly dodged a machete aimed at his head, while a mob of neighbors charged, screaming that they would cripple him if he didn't surrender his fortress. Chen Xiao moved with sudden speed, catching the attackers off guard. He seized one man's wrist, twisting it until the weapon fell to the ground. When a second assailant tried to strike from behind, he sidestepped the blow with ease. Now armed with a captured blade, he faced the remaining mob. With a cold, steady gaze, he delivered a blur of rapid slashes that left the entire group wounded and writhing on the ground in seconds. One of the fallen men trembled, shouting in disbelief that he would dare commit such violence in broad daylight with so many witnesses. A system alert popped up, noting a massive spike of 1,000 fear points. Chen Xiao replied coolly that he had no intention of killing them because he didn't want to get his hands dirty. Internally, he knew that a quick death was too merciful. In this sweltering heat, their wounds would inevitably become infected, leaving them to rot slowly in agony over the coming days. Upon reaching the factory in the West District, Chen Xiao spotted a security camera and promptly sliced through the wiring. As he slipped into the interior, he was hit by a wave of thick, toxic gas that sent him into a violent coughing fit. He realized he had walked into a trap and cursed his luck. Suddenly, a figure wearing a gas mask appeared and injected him with a syringe, calmly inquiring if he felt any relief. The stranger explained that while the nerve gas wasn't lethal, it was certainly uncomfortable. Demandingly, Chen Xiao asked for their identity, suspicious of why there were guards when Liu Haifeng hadn't mentioned any. Though he wondered if he had been set up, he noticed that the two individuals didn't seem to harbor any immediate malice. The man behind the mask introduced himself as Lin Guodong, a biomedical researcher specialized in human evolution within harsh climates. He then presented his student Su Rui, who greeted the visitor with a wave. Lin explained that the toxic gas served as a security measure against thieves, though he admitted he was fascinated by the precise way the camera wire had been severed. Despite the intrusion, he thanked the protagonist for saving him. The young man remained wary, however, noting that the facility looked more like a sophisticated laboratory than a simple pharmacy. Granting him full access, Lin told him to take whatever supplies he needed as both an apology and a welcoming gift. After packing his bag with various medications, Chen Xiao thanked them and prepared to depart. As he turned away, the professor watched him closely and remarked that they would see each other again. By the time he arrived home that evening, the young man felt a lingering sense of dread. Although the scientist had helped him, there was something deeply unsettling about the way the man had looked at him. Inside his shelter, he checked the community group chat to find people frantically offering high prices for antibiotics and bandages. In response, Chen Xiao shared a photo of his new supplies, commenting on their high quality, but he explicitly stated that nothing was for sale. This sparked a wave of fury from the neighbors. While some labeled him a selfish monster, others swore to kill him once they recovered. As notifications for anger and jealousy flooded his system, the protagonist began organizing his gear. Suddenly, his heart stopped when he discovered a small metallic device hidden among the pills. Realizing it was a tracker, he smirked and decided to turn the situation into a game. Spying a stray white cat near a dumpster, he approached the animal and asked for a small favor. He carefully fastened the device to its back and encouraged the cat to head to its favorite spots. As the cat scampered away and climbed up some pipes, the tracking signal began to move erratically across the city map. On his laptop, a frustrated Lin Guodong watched the chaotic pattern, completely baffled by his target's movements. Back in his fortress, Chen Xiao continued reading the group chat. A man pleaded for medicine for his sick brother, while a mother offered her child's books in exchange for water. He watched her performance with a cold heart, remembering her manipulative tactics from his previous life. She eventually targeted him directly, attacking his character and claiming his lack of humanity was the reason he would always be alone. Unmoved by the woman's pleas, Chen Xiao reflected that since the child wasn't his, he had no obligation to help. He was certain that moral blackmail and hypocrisy would never influence his decisions. To turn the tables, he shared a surveillance photo he had captured, which clearly showed a neighbor named Wang Wei secretly moving crates of supplies into her home. He challenged the group chat, suggesting that if Wang Wei shared her 3 cases of water and 2 boxes of canned goods, he would personally match whatever she provided. Inside her apartment, Wang Wei was paralyzed with shock, suddenly realizing that Chen Xiao's cameras had caught her every move. The sentiment of the group chat shifted instantly as the residents began demanding her hidden stash. It wasn't long before a desperate mob forced their way into her home. While one man shouted for her to surrender the food, another threatened her against resisting. They ignored her cries, ransacking the apartment and seizing every supply they could find. Even the woman who had been begging for her child earlier slipped into the room, greedily filling her own bags while completely neglecting her son. Wang Wei was eventually left alone, bruised and weeping in the ruins of her home. Meanwhile, panic erupted in a nearby stairwell where residents stood over a lifeless body, fearing that the rapid decay in the heat would trigger a deadly disease. At that moment, Lin Guodong and Su Rui arrived, identifying themselves as a medical team from the CDC sent to assist. As he prepared his equipment, the professor apologized for the delay, citing blocked roads as the reason for his late arrival. He explained to the hopeful crowd that professional disposal of the deceased was mandatory to prevent a massive epidemic in such extreme temperatures. To win their trust, he distributed a limited supply of medicine and disinfectant, which led the grateful neighbors to believe that the government was still looking out for them. While helping the crowd, Lin Guodong noted that his tracking signal had become erratic in this specific area, confirming that his target was nearby. Watching from his window, Chen Xiao was stunned to see Professor Lin and immediately understood that the man was hunting him. His train of thought was interrupted when his phone vibrated with the text from an unlisted number, warning him to be wary of the doctor. Confused by the mysterious message, he looked out at the city skyline, realizing a new player had entered the game. On a distant rooftop, a hidden figure observed the neighborhood through a telescope. When Chen Xiao attempted to call the number back, an automated recording informed him it was a virtual line, leaving him certain that someone was watching him from the shadows while carefully concealing their identity. Gazing out his window, the protagonist stared at his phone with deep skepticism. He couldn't decide if the mysterious text was a genuine warning or a calculated attempt to use him as a weapon against the professor. Meanwhile, in the street below, Lin Guodong addressed the gathered crowd, advising them to stay vigilant against heat stroke and promising his medical assistance to anyone feeling unwell. From his vantage point, Chen Zhuo maintained a cold, watchful eye on the doctor. He noticed suspicious stains on the man's clothing that looked like a mixture of blood and dried chemical reagents. This sight triggered a chilling memory from his previous life. Shortly after the heat waves began, medical teams had emerged under the guise of disease prevention to collect blood samples. Following their arrival, physically strong individuals began to vanish without a trace. Unaware of the eyes on him, Lin Guodong posted a notice on the community board announcing a free health clinic in the 3rd underground parking lot. The promise of checkups, wound care, and free water left the neighbors ecstatic, with many praising the professor's apparent generosity. Later, in a secluded alley, Lin Guodong found the white cat and petted it as it ate, realizing then that he had been tricked and his tracking attempt had been discovered. This realization fed the protagonist's system, which reported that it had harvested the doctor's frustration and silence. Watching from the shadows, Chen Zhuo finally confirmed that it was indeed Lin Guodong who had been hunting him. The following day, the underground parking lot was packed with survivors relieved to find a slightly cooler environment. At the check-in station, the professor and his assistant meticulously recorded names and medical histories. When an elderly man named Chen Da mentioned his high blood pressure while having his blood drawn, the team dismissively claimed the procedure was merely routine. Chen Zhuo, hidden among the crowd, carefully observed these interactions, trying to uncover the professor's true motive. The atmosphere shifted when a group of young men arrived, carrying a friend with a severe infection and pleading for help. Lin Guodong produced a vial of a glowing blue substance called the T7 prototype, describing it as an advanced enhancer designed to fight infection and speed up healing. As the liquid was injected into the man's arm, the doctor watched with a detached, icy expression, telling the patient he would soon be better. Although the man, Bu, offered his sweaty thanks as the drug entered his system, his eyes quickly became glazed and vacant. Chen Zhuo watched this transformation closely, curious about what exactly his old classmate was looking for. By that evening, Bu's condition worsened. As he walked with his friends, he told his boss, Zhang Qiang, that his bones felt like they were on fire, describing the sensation as absolutely unbearable. As the infection took hold beneath his bandages, Bu's veins began to swell and throb with an eerie red glow. His features twisted in pain until his eyes radiated a crimson light, signaling a violent surge of energy throughout his body. While his friends looked on in absolute terror, Bu let out a roar of fury and lunged at Zhang Qiang, seizing him by the throat. Despite the boss's desperate attempts to remind Bu of his status, the experimental drug had turned the young man's long-standing resentment into raw power. Filled with bitterness, Bu asked why Zhang Qiang hadn't acted like a boss when he used him as a human shield against a knife. With a show of unnatural strength, he slammed Zhang Qiang into the pavement. Sensing a presence nearby, the panting mutant spun around and demanded that the intruder show themselves. Chen Zhuo emerged calmly from the darkness of the alley. Recognizing him immediately, a drug-crazed Bu screamed the protagonist's name and charged. However, Chen Zhuo easily sidestepped the attack, noting that while the man's strength had multiplied, his movements were clumsy and his joints appeared stiff. He realized then that this was no ordinary medical reaction. As Bu lunged a second time, Chen Zhuo gathered dark energy in his palm and announced that the fight was over. He unleashed a precise spatial slash that acted as an invisible blade, instantly decapitating the mutated man. Bu's massive frame collapsed lifelessly to the ground. Later that evening, Lin Guodong navigated the deserted alleys, guided by a tracking device. He had hidden a nanorobot tracker within the T7 reagent and was puzzled as to why the signal had once again vanished in this specific spot. His confusion turned to shock when he discovered Zhang Qiang trembling next to Bu's headless body. After scanning the victim's face, the professor's tablet confirmed that while the T7 prototype had triggered a mental collapse, it hadn't actually killed him. Crouching down, Lin examined the neck and noted the impossibly smooth, clean cut. The exact same mark he had seen on Liu Haifeng and the tampered door locks. He concluded that an ordinary human without specialized tools could never have done this. Recalling his encounter with Chen Zhuo, the doctor smiled, convinced that the young man possessed the very thing he had been searching for. Suddenly, Zhang Qiang began to cough up blood. Approaching him, Lin Guodong warned him to stay still, suggesting his lungs might be hemorrhaging. Recognizing the professor, Zhang Qiang pleaded for his life and asked what had happened to his friend. Feigning sympathy for the dead man, Lin showed Zhang Qiang a photo of Chen Zhuo on his tablet. He deceitfully suggested that Chen Zhuo was responsible for Bu's death and asked if he knew where to find him. Terrified and seeking revenge, Zhang Qiang confirmed that he knew exactly where the young man lived and offered to lead the way. Feeling pleased with the situation, Lin Guodong assured the man that he had nothing to worry about, though he insisted that professional care at his well-equipped laboratory was necessary. Zhang Qiang was incredibly grateful for the offer. However, as they walked through the sterile hallways of the facility later that day, Zhang Qiang grew curious. He asked how Abu could have transformed so violently when he had seemed perfectly fine immediately following the shot. With a detached tone, the professor claimed it was simply a rare and severe rejection of the chemical formula, promising a thorough examination to determine the proper course of action. Panic finally set in for Zhang Qiang when they reached a formidable sealed entrance. Suddenly hesitant, he suggested that he would rather just go home with some antibiotics to recover on his own. Ignoring the plea, Lin Guodong swiped his access card to open the isolation ward. He leaned toward the trembling man and whispered an ominous warning, telling him to stay silent for the sake of science and his own well-being. Zhang Qiang's desperate cries for mercy were cut short as he was shoved into the room. The heavy door clicked shut, the isolation warning light flickered on, and his screams began to resonate throughout the corridor. Meanwhile, Chen Xiaoyu was relaxing on his sofa inside his fortified home. As he lay there staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but speculate about the professor's ultimate goals. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell, prompting him to sit up and check the security feed. On the monitor, he saw Lin Guodong standing right outside his front gate. The doctor looked directly into the camera with a smile, introducing himself and politely asking if they could have a conversation. After confirming he had found the right house, Professor Lin stepped inside, briefly noting how the intense heat had completely obscured the stars. He was met by Shen Xiao, who stood waiting in the dark with his arms crossed. The young man got straight to the point, asking why the doctor had come to visit at such a late hour. Lin simply replied that he had heard where Shen Xiao lived and decided to drop by. Despite the obvious tension, Shen Xiao wasn't surprised. He had expected this confrontation, though he hadn't anticipated the professor showing up so quickly. As they sat down, Lin commented that their reunion had happened sooner than expected. He immediately began examining the room, pointing out the double-paned glass and the independent water system. It was clear to the doctor that this wasn't a normal home, but a bunker designed for the end of the world. With a sharp look, he asked Shen Xiao if he had known the extreme heat wave was coming in advance. Shen Xiao avoided the question with a smile and a ridiculous excuse. He joked that he had simply bought a renovation package with a 50-year guarantee, claiming he never expected it to make him look like a prophet. Lin didn't find the joke funny. Getting serious, he brought up the deaths of a neighbor and Liu Haifeng. He explained that his examination of the bodies revealed surgical precision that even military weapons couldn't replicate, as the vertebrae had been cut instantly. Even with this implied accusation, Shen Xiao remained perfectly calm and acted innocent. He curiously asked if those deaths were caused by some kind of special weapon, and jokingly asked the professor to recommend it to him if he ever found it. When Lin ironically asked why he would need such a thing, Shen Xiao smiled and said he just needed a better way to cut steak, explaining that the heat was making his meat tough and his refrigerator unstable. The protagonist's ridiculous excuse left even the brilliant professor speechless for a moment. This bold move was immediately recognized by the system, which rewarded Shen Xiao with points for his audacity. However, Lin chose to ignore the provocation entirely, shifting the conversation back to more serious matters. He insisted that regardless of any jokes, both deaths were clearly the work of the same individual, someone with professional skills far beyond those of an average citizen. Responding coldly, Shen Xiao suggested that the victims might have simply been unlucky, perhaps getting involved in things they should have avoided. The professor, maintaining a subtle smile, pointed out a curious coincidence. Both deceased men had been in direct conflict with Shen Xiao. A heavy silence filled the room as the two men locked eyes, each waiting for the other to make the next move. Eventually, Shen Xiao broke the tension with his usual sarcasm. He remarked that the professor had a real talent for comedy and reiterated that he was just an ordinary person. He then gestured toward the medical kit Lin had brought, a white box marked with a red cross sitting ominously on the table, and mockingly asked if the doctor thought he was on the verge of death. Changing the subject, Shen Xiao inquired how the professor had managed to find his address, since he had never shared it. In response, Lin pulled out his phone to show him the source. Someone Shen Xiao knew had given him up. For the first time, Shen Xiao's composure cracked. A drop of cold sweat ran down his face as he saw an image of a severely injured Zhang Qiang connected to a respirator. Lin calmly explained that he was currently saving the man's life. Although Shen Xiao asked about Zhang Qiang's condition, his thoughts turned dark. He knew that while Zhang Qiang had a strong will to live, Being at the mercy of a manipulator like Lin was a fate worse than death. The professor then revealed his true colors. With a satisfied smile, he explained that Zhang Chang was undergoing a new type of therapy, claiming that the extreme heat would eventually force all humans to evolve. According to Lin, Zhang Chang was simply starting the process earlier than everyone else. Realizing that the professor was actually conducting human experiments, Shen Xiao's sarcasm vanished, and he sternly demanded to know the real reason for the visit. Back in Lin's laboratory, Zhang Chang's body began to react violently. His hands shook as veins bulged beneath his skin, and his eyes snapped open with an eerie, hollow glow. As the mutation took hold, his body arched in agony, and his muscles swelled to an unnatural size. A system alert confirmed the chaos, showing that while his vital signs were failing, his genetic mutation rate had already climbed to 37%. Meanwhile, in the living room, Professor Lin placed a syringe filled with a glowing blue liquid on the table. He slowly slid it toward Shen Xiao, describing it as an immune booster he had created. He insisted the substance was completely safe, but Shen Xiao couldn't help but mock him again. Looking at the fluid, he joked that it looked like cranberry soda, and asked if he was supposed to shake it before drinking. This jab left the professor speechless once more, earning Shen Xiao even more points from the system. However, Shen Xiao's demeanor shifted as he picked up the syringe. He admitted he knew neither of them was ordinary, and that he understood the cold logic behind the experiment. He noted that while the survival rate was likely under 10%, some people would inevitably evolve. Staring directly at the doctor, he bluntly asked if Lin expected him to undergo the same evolution as Zhang Chang. Adjusting his glasses, Lin tried to justify his methods by claiming that scientific progress always required sacrifices. He invited Shen Xiao to collaborate on his research to find a way for humanity to adapt to the new world. When Shen Xiao provocatively asked what would happen if he refused, Lin remained unruffled. He painted a grim picture of a future filled with strange diseases, mutant monsters, and lethal heat, arguing that cooperation was the only path to survival. Leaving the syringe on the table, Lin walked away with a confident smile, telling Shen Xiao that his laboratory doors were always open. As he left the house, the professor's true intentions became clear. He found Shen Xiao's strong will fascinating and viewed him as a living specimen far more valuable than any data. In his mind, there was no escape for the young man. Alone inside, Shen Xiao stared at the dangerous object in silence. He reflected on Lin's twisted mindset, how the man used grand speeches to hide the fact that he was experimenting on living people. He realized that as long as the professor was alive, he would never have peace. A cold, dark determination settled over him. With a grim smile, he accepted the challenge, vowing that if the doctor wanted to study evolution, he would show him what true evolution really looked like. The setting shifts back to the laboratory, where the being that was once Zhang Qiang has lost all semblance of humanity. Now a massive creature covered in bulging muscles, he lets out a terrifying roar, his eyes filled with primal rage. From the safety of the control room, Professor Lin monitors the screens, confirming that the transformation is complete. Although the subject's physical vitals are stable, his sanity has completely vanished. Watching the data, Lin smiles with satisfaction. His experiment has proven that hatred and pain are the ideal triggers for mutation. He then addresses the beast with a malicious tone, telling Zhang Qiang that he has been reborn and commanding him to capture Shen Xiao alive. Standing nearby, the assistant, Su Rui, watches the scene in a state of shock. She questions whether turning living people into monsters can truly be called human evolution. Lin merely turns to her, asking how she feels participating in her first real experiment, before coldly ordering her to activate the system. When Suroi protests, arguing that they have abandoned all ethical boundaries, Lin laughs dismissively. He claims that morality is a luxury they cannot afford during an apocalypse, and justifies the sacrifice of Zhang Qiang as a necessary step for the survival of others. With that, he presses a red button on the console, giving the final command for the creature to move out. The monster responds instantly, his veins throbbing as he prepares to unleash his fury. Through the intercom, Lin repeats his cruel demand to have Shen Xiao brought to him. With a deafening metallic crash, the creature smashes through a heavy steel door and emerges into the moonlight. High among the city's skyscrapers, the beast sets its sights on Shen Xiao's fortified shelter, moving across the rooftops with superhuman speed and strength. When the creature arrives at the corridor outside Shen Xiao's apartment, he finds it empty. His deformed muscles tense as he growls, his sharpened senses telling him that his prey is nearby. Catching a familiar scent, he snaps his head around and looks down. There, in the shadows below, Shen Xiao is leaning casually against a tree, waiting. With a mocking smile, the protagonist greets him, commenting on how much his appearance has changed. He sarcastically asks if he should still use the name Zhang Qiang, or if a common dog's name would be more appropriate. The insult works perfectly. Zhang Qiang's rage boils over, and the system rewards Shen Xiao with 1,000 points of anger. Consumed by hate and barely able to speak, the monster can only stutter a furious threat, vowing that Shen Xiao must die. Observing the transformation, Shen couldn't help but smile. He realized that the creature's heightened emotions would make the system's point collection 30% more efficient. Amused by the situation, he began to retreat, beckoning the monster to follow him to a more open area. He jokingly explained that he didn't want to fight right outside his doorstep to avoid disturbing the neighbors, adding that if his shelter were damaged, Zhang Qiang certainly couldn't afford the repairs. The chase led them into an abandoned underground parking lot, where Zhang Qiang dropped onto all fours like a predatory animal. Ready for the confrontation, Shen Xiao swung his arm with a sudden movement, warning his foe that he was about to experience the power of a spatial cut. Although the invisible strike landed directly on Zhang Qiang's chest, Shen was stunned to see it fail. The creature's mutated skin had become so thick that the attack didn't leave a single scratch. Shen watched closely, noting that the beast's hide was far tougher than he had anticipated. With gritted teeth and eyes full of malice, Zhang Qiang growled Shen's name and launched a counterattack. The creature lunged with pure brutality, but Shen used his superior agility to dodge the strike effortlessly. As he circled the parking lot, he continued to taunt the monster, remarking that Zhang Qiang had always been all muscle and no brains, and now he couldn't even speak properly. The insult hit its mark, as the system logged over 1,200 points of pure rage. Approaching the deformed being again, Shen clicked his tongue in disgust, commenting on how hideous he had become. He sarcastically suggested that Professor Lin had terrible taste, and offered to introduce the monster to a good stylist. This final humiliation pushed Zhang Qiang's fractured mind over the edge. A massive surge of fury took hold of the creature, granting Shen an incredible 2,000 points of negative emotion. However, Shen's smirk vanished when he noticed a strange change. The creature's body began to shake and swell even further. He realized too late that he had made a mistake, as Zhang Qiang's reaction to the anger was far more intense than expected. Before Shen could react, something moved behind him with blinding speed. He couldn't even track the movement with his eyes. Suddenly, sharp bone spikes erupted from the monster's body, piercing through Shen's hoodie and tearing into his skin. The rage had triggered a secondary mutation. Clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers, Shen cursed under his breath, realizing for the first time that he was in real danger. Zhang Qiang had gained the terrifying ability to sprout bone spikes from his body. Back at the laboratory, Professor Lin watched the monitors with intense scientific excitement, exclaiming that they were witnessing a second-stage mutation. He explained that extreme emotional peaks could act as a catalyst for new evolutionary phases and eagerly ordered Surui to record every detail. However, Surui filed the data with a look of pure horror, questioning whether turning human beings into monsters could truly be considered saving humanity. In the underground parking lot, Shen Xiao regained his balance and stared at the creature Zhang Qiang had become. The battle had just become significantly more lethal. As the mutation reached its peak, more bone spikes erupted from the monster's back and its muscles pulsed violently. The beast let out a deep roar, guttering out his enemy's name, while his feet shifted into claws sharp enough to crack the concrete floor. Driven by pure hatred, Zhang Qiang lunged at Shen like a blur of red fury and jagged bone. Despite the danger, Shen Xiao remained perfectly composed. He stepped aside with a slight movement, letting the attack pass without a scratch. Frustrated and angry at missing his first strike, the creature glared at him. Although Shen had blood on his chest and at the corner of his mouth, he showed no signs of distress or pain. In fact, everything was unfolding according to his plan. A system notification appeared, confirming that Zhang Qiang's energy levels were still climbing. Wiping the blood from his lip, Shen realized he only needed a little more provocation to reach his goal. He began to mock the creature again, asking if that was really all it could do, and joking that it just looked like a prickly little thing with a few extra bones. The reaction was instantaneous, with the system logging over 1,000 points for both rage and humiliation. As Zhang Qiang gnashed his teeth and roared, Shen continued his verbal assault. He reminded the monster that back when he was just a cheap thug, he at least had the guts to fight with an iron pipe. He then questioned if Zhang Qiang actually believed he was important just because of some injections and new bones. The creature shrieked, consumed by shame and anger. Finally, Shen Xiao delivered the ultimate insult, stating that no matter how much Zhang Qiang changed, he would always be nothing more than a dog biting whoever Professor Lin pointed at. This triggered another massive emotional explosion, resulting in over 1,700 points of rage as Zhang Qiang completely lost his mind. In the control room, Professor Lin watched the monitors with a satisfied smile, noting to Su Rui that the subject had finally reached its emotional peak. He remarked that Shen Xiao was being incredibly helpful by stimulating the test subject. With a cruel gaze, Lin mentally encouraged the creature to grow even angrier, eager to see the absolute limits of the mutation. Su Rui, however, watched the screen with growing concern, trying to figure out what Shen Xiao's actual plan was. Pushing his rage to the limit, Zhang Qiang's body exploded with an intense red aura. He let out a deafening roar and launched a storm of bone spikes directly at his opponent. Shen Xiao dodged every projectile with impressive clarity and a bored expression. He mockingly asked if that was the monster's best effort, pausing to give a provocative smile before telling the creature to try again if it had the courage. This final taunt worked perfectly. Zhang Qiang's fury boiled over, rewarding Shen Xiao with a massive 2,800 points. At that moment, a critical system notification appeared. Negative emotions had reached the 30,000 point threshold. This allowed his ability to evolve into Spatial Rift, Annihilation. As Zhang Qiang launched a final desperate attack, Shen Xiao immediately confirmed the upgrade. A terrifying power gathered in the palm of his hand as a small sphere of absolute darkness appeared, warping the space around it. This was the power of annihilation. Zhang Qiang's bone spikes disintegrated instantly upon contact with the sphere. When the void touched the creature's body, the effect was immediate. His arm and leg weren't just cut, they were erased from reality. Shen Xiao watched coldly as the mutilated monster collapsed. Zhang Qiang stared in shock at his missing limbs, his voice trembling as he struggled to understand what had happened. Indifferent to the creature's suffering, Shen Xiao approached the dying body and ripped a collar from its neck. This was the device connecting the monster to its creator. Speaking directly into the collar's camera, Shen sent a message to the man watching. He told Professor Lin that his test subject was a failure and suggested that next time, he should send someone who actually knows how to fight. Back in the lab, the transmission cut out, leaving Professor Lin grinding his teeth in a fit of rage. He muttered Shen Xiao's name, but his anger quickly shifted into something else. A twisted smile spread across his face, and he began to laugh like a madman. Lin admitted to himself that this opponent was unlike anyone else, yet he vowed that he would eventually catch him. Meanwhile, Zhang Qiang's body was slowly disintegrating in the underground parking lot. Shen Xiao approached the remains to finish the job, placing a hand on his defeated enemy's head. Looking down at the miserable creature, he remarked that since Zhang Qiang had become so pathetic, he would help end his suffering. With a cold stare and a voice devoid of emotion, Shen Xiao took the monster's life. Silence returned to the area, but as Shen Xiao turned to leave, something caught his attention. Distinct, elegant footsteps echoed through the darkness, the sound of polished dress shoes hitting the dirty concrete. A voice emerged from the shadows, followed by slow, rhythmic clapping. The stranger praised the performance as magnificent, prompting Shen Xiao to instantly drop back into a fighting stance. His expression turned icy as he demanded to know the person's identity, his eyes searching the dark for a new threat. A man stepped calmly into the light, walking toward the pool of blood without any hesitation. He was dressed in a sharp suit with white gloves and glasses, using a silk handkerchief to discreetly cover his nose. Introducing himself as Shen Xiqing, he spoke with a touch of disgust, noting that the scent of death always felt primitive to him. He congratulated the protagonist on the fight he had just witnessed, claiming that while the world was entering a desperate era, it was also a time for new gods to rise. Shen Xiao didn't lower his guard for a second, watching the stranger with extreme caution. As the man spoke, the protagonist quietly gathered his energy, prepared to strike at any moment. Shen Xiqing continued his evaluation, stating that someone with such precision and destructive power certainly couldn't be just another failed experiment created by the insane Lin Guodong. Hearing the name of his enemy made Shen Xiao switch instantly to high alert. He demanded to know if the stranger knew Lin Guodong or if he was working for him. Shen Xiqing shook his head with a smile, explaining that the situation was actually the complete opposite. He claimed he was there specifically to stop the professor's destructive path, and revealed that he was the person behind the anonymous warning message Shen Xiao had received earlier. While Shen Xiao was still processing how this stranger had found his contact information, Shen Jixing produced a black business card. He introduced himself as a member of the ARC Group, an organization boasting a highly efficient and private intelligence network. His goal was straightforward. He wanted to invite Shen Xiao to join them, to achieve what he described as true evolution. Shen Xiao stayed quiet, reflecting on how the awakened individuals were appearing much sooner in this new life than he had anticipated. Xixing went on to argue that ARC's methods were vastly superior to Lin Guodong's. While the professor created mindless, grotesque mutants, ARC focused on complete enhancement, allowing their members to evolve while remaining rational and looking human. Suspicious, Shen Xiao asked for more details about the group. Jixing described ARC as a faction dedicated to finding awakened individuals, believing the world was on the brink of a massive transformation. He explained that only exceptional people, the elite, like Shen Xiao, would survive and form a new humanity. The offer was filled with grand promises of power and control, suggesting this was the only path to becoming a god, something Lin could never provide. Shen Xiao listened to the entire speech, but his response was not what Jixing expected. He scoffed, remarking that the pitch sounded more like the words of a con artist than a path to divinity. Suddenly, a small object sliced through the air with incredible speed. A cotton swab struck the business card Jixing was holding, tearing it perfectly in half. As the stranger stood there in shock, Shen Xiao just smiled and sarcastically apologized, saying his hand had slipped. Without a moment's hesitation, Shen Xiao turned his back on the stranger and flatly turned down the offer. He made it clear that he despised anyone trying to control his life, whether it was a mad scientist like Lin Guodong or a hypocritical elitist like Shen Xixing. Insisting on forging his own path, he firmly stated that he was used to being on his own and required no guidance on how to live. The man in the suit showed no signs of anger despite the rejection. Instead, he seemed even more fascinated. With a peculiar smile, he remarked on Shen Xiao's bravery and admitted that he was starting to like him more and more. As the protagonist walked away, Shen Jixing issued a final warning, suggesting that while growing up wild might keep someone alive for a while in a collapsing world, it wouldn't last forever. Shen Xiao replied without even glancing back, telling the man not to worry about him. Suddenly, his body warped through space and vanished entirely. Staring at the empty spot where the young man had just been, Shen Jixing finished his thought, noting that the doors to ARC would remain open for whenever Shen Xiao realized the limits of a single person's power. Although he tried to stay composed, the sudden display of teleportation left him deeply unsettled. The system picked up on his conflicting emotions, recording a mix of disdain, shock, and a hint of anxiety. Reappearing a few meters away, Shen Xiao noted with interest that even someone as seemingly stable as Jixing could generate a significant amount of negative energy for the system. The word limit stuck in his mind, but it only served to fuel his determination. If a limit truly existed, he intended to shatter it. However, before focusing on that new goal, he remembered an urgent matter that still needed resolving. His gaze turned icy as his thoughts drifted back to the professor. With total resolve, he decided that the time had finally come to put an end to his conflict with Lin Guodong once and for all.